Wonderful. So, thank you guys for joining me once again on the third eye of Providence. And I am so pleased that we are in Pisces season. Like I said on the last update for this channel, I decided I wanted to start opening up about my spiritual journey and having more conversations with the community and just following what spirit has guided me to do, which is to share what has helped me and come together with others to really make an offering to the collective. So that's what we're doing here on this channel, and that's why I have today my guest Darren. And I'm really happy that they have decided to have a fun little conversation with me about spiritual practice. So, Darren, why don't you give a little bit of a background on your spiritual practice and journey?
Hi there. I'm Darren, and basically, I've been sort of involved in spirituality my entire life. As a very young person, I was deeply interested in these topics, and it sort of took me into various realms. I grew up in an atheist household, so at a young age, I got introduced into Christianity, which played a huge role in my early thought. But as I got older and started to learn more, I drifted away from that and more into ideas of Wicca and occultism, which then led me to study religious studies in university and to really get interested in a variety of topics through philosophy and Hinduism and various things. And I even had the opportunity to study abroad in India and explore these things a little more in depth. And since then, my practice is what I would call sort of a creative occultism that's inspired by ideas of animism.
That's wonderful. And, I think we have this similar um, approach to finding spirituality on our own and not being indoctrinized by our family. Certainly my background and my family, they were religious, but really non practicing. And it wasn't until I had like really intense dark nights of the soul experiences in my late 20s that I really started to explore religion and spirituality and really embracing these titles. And it's kind of complicated when you come from this background of like non-religious people. You're surrounded by people that are quote unquote punk and definitely identify with like anarchism and leftist thinking politics, liberals. And then you come about to spirituality and you start to embrace this moniker, and it's really hard to hold on to that label in the circles of counterculture thinking.
Oh, definitely. Like I said, because I grew up in this more of an atheist family and a very leftist family, those ideas and materialism and anarchism played sort of a central role. So I always had this give and take throughout most of my youth and early adulthood, where I would veer between being ultra spiritual and atheist, and was very confused for a long time. And I had to just learn at a certain point to accept myself and how I was perceiving the world, and how spirituality was intrinsic to that, and how it just kept appearing. And it became a sort of realization at a certain point where aspects of like greater truth or absolute truth is an impossibility in our current forms on this plane. And I had to embrace that rather uncertain element of thought. And academia was not going to provide that for me. And instead, you needed to trust your intuition and to realize that the world is sort of what you perceive it to be.
Absolutely. I I think we struggle especially in this time period where there's a lot of unfortunate um isolation that happens as a result of being super interconnected. Uh Obviously outside of the times of the quarantine, even before that, it's just it's really hard to embrace aspects of yourself that can't be labeled, can't be identified, can't really conform into a box. And people, well, I think you feel like people are going to reject it, right? And that's the hardest thing, is standing in your authenticity and showing up really like brave in your conviction when you're not even sure. you know
No, exactly, right? Like it comes down to this thing where anything that we try to label upon the world is just that, it's a label, right? Like we are able to perceive truth to a point and able to understand these things, but it's always to a point, and it's perceived through our own experiences, our own perceptions. We can expand that through working in community, but even still, we're limited. And so much about spirituality and spiritual practice is about embracing those limitations and embracing the unknown and
Mm.
realizing that it is up to us to make these contacts and to have that greater expansion of the mind, which is possible through spiritual practice. And this was something that I came to realize. The more I studied, the more I sat with myself, the more I had these deep revelations. But then when you try to present this to friends and to family, a lot of people are either unwilling or unable to process these ideas as you do, or as various religious collectives do. And I also grew
Mhm.
to understand that there's just such a wide variety of religious thought and spiritual thought, but they're also so deeply interconnected. Like certain ideas have really resonated with me, specifically ideas of philosophia or religio perennis, that all of these beliefs are interconnected, that there are true myths out there that have been corrupted by various power structures and hierarchies that seek to impose upon us. So I've taken the philosophies of like leftism and anarchism and sort of applied it to an understanding of spirituality where I try to break down these myths and try to find their truer interconnectedness across cultures. And academia really opened my eyes to that. But even still, within an academic framework, it's about trying to intellectualize these things. And I believe that's a folly to a certain point. It's
Mm.
really about internalizing and embracing them into your own perceptions and learning to trust your intuition. And that's why, like, my spiritual practice and what's so important for me is to be creative, to really find what resonates with me, to attempt to integrate it into my spiritual practice. And if it works, if it brings me closer to spirit, then I continue to utilize it. And it's also to be open to others and to really embrace what they have to teach from their own experience, no matter how small, even people who aren't spiritual, because it's so important to recognize that the best way to understand is in community, and to check your ego at the door, and to embrace the experiences of yourself and others, regardless of whether you can know them to be true for sure. You know, letting those trappings go and really just, you have to go on gut with this sort of thing, and and trust that
Mm.
that the truth will be revealed in a sense.
And recognize and roll with it when you do feel like you are at a point of expansion within yourself, and it has to be materialized externally, right? So you do a lot of this reflective work. You talk about a lot of reading and just really digging into philosophy, and even in the context of academia, a lot of this stuff is done singularly and then presented in an official format to the peers. But there's certainly a different process of spiritual expansion that comes with spiritual community, when people come and you cannot help but recognize that this is something beyond. There's lessons to be learned from these people, or there's information to be exchanged, and you have to really roll with it even when you're not feeling like you have anything to offer, feeling like you have any official status or any like um, research that's actually grounded in anything other than your experience, it is challenging to kind of embrace that type of a power and responsibility. But I feel like definitely more and more people are stepping up to it, and this is kind of where I'm at, and this is where I recognize you are in a position to walk that path too, which is why I invited you on the channel to discuss these topics. And it's so interesting because I do see there's such a difference between the two schools, so to speak, of like where we come from background with spirituality and philosophy and everything. But it's really wonderful how much we've been able to share and really learn from each other, like have a lot of offering intuitively and you have a lot of offering like intellectually. And I think it's a really nice balance of the forces, you know. So
Yeah, for sure. And like it was an important lesson for me to learn and to recognize that much of academia is a trap. They claim to be able to provide you with these authoritation, like make you an authority, but really all you've done is sort of studied something. And you're not, authority really comes from something that's given to you by community. And if you meet a true religious leader or a guru or whatever you want to call them, that power always is granted to them by others. It's not by these institutions of academic higher thought. That does not make one an expert in these things. It makes you
right.
an expert in language. It makes you an expert maybe in the science of philosophy and how to apply philosophy. But you cannot truly understand these things until you engage with people who practice them in the real world, and you really try to understand various spiritual cultures from that cultural point. Like we need to, I believe it's so important to break down these hierarchical sort of systems and try to see how spirituality plays out in the real world for real people. And that's where you get true understanding. Like this is one of the things that I've been able to experience through our conversations and through our friendship is you are engaged in active practice, and through that engagement it is created an understanding. And you may not have the same philosophical basis that I do, but you come to the same philosophical conclusions and you've thought about
Mm-hmm.
it deeply. And this is true of the vast majority of spiritual people. And we're so quick to dismiss each other and to question each other rather than to listen and to think, well, why did spirit put this person into my life? What do they have to
Mm-hmm.
offer in this moment? And so much for me that's important is to understand it from like a general philosophical background where like I believe we're placed upon this earth to evolve, that the eventually we're supposed to achieve enlightenment, but we're all fulfilling our sort of our karmic bonds in this life, what we're supposed to learn. And you can only learn and understand in communion. You can only know through knowing the other. And really embracing that and trying to take from as many different sources, from as many different people and cultural traditions as possible, while respecting them, of course, and sort of incorporating them into the self so that you become greater than what you are as an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I am, it's funny, it just circles back to what we were just talking about, but I'm at a point in my life where I am really focused on embodiment of my spirituality because I really had been compartmentalized with my practices. I had made it a part time thing, I had made it this peripheral interest that really compelled me. I could not turn away from it, but it wasn't until I came into community with others and I saw them and they were embodied spiritual practitioners. They had, um, you know, abandoned the matrix, so to speak, where they were walking in their authentic spiritual beingness. Everything to them was a lesson. All aspects of their lives were touched and dipped in spiritual like aspects. So I came into communion with people like this, and I really had to see myself in that person, why I admired them, right? Why, not to say that they were gurus, but there was something about them that I felt led by them, by what they were doing. And now I am in a position where I want to honor those parts of myself, right? That's what I'm doing right now. And it is really difficult, but it's so necessary because the expansion is exponential. Now that I walk in my truth and I embrace my spiritual beingness as whole of my identity, it inspires more and more people to connect with me and also recognize those parts of themselves, which is so radical. Like, this is actually the best revelation to me, was how this is really the ethos that I wanted to embody. Is not that I need to convince everybody that I'm on the right side, or we all have to be, accepting and adopting of the same labels. No, it's just like they honor and recognize the truth that I am embodying, and then they want to do that for themselves. Not that it's the same, but they want to be in the same energy, which is super.
Exactly. And like for me, I was sort of bound by these trappings of trying to find the truth, trying to find the correct spiritual path, trying to find gurus. And you you wind up locking yourself in. And the reality of most of these things is that there are these hierarchical, detrimental things. Like many of these gurus, even if they aren't, not, I shouldn't, even if they aren't doing bad things, the communities that arise around them, and they become dogmatic, they become indoctrinating, they become a sole focus, they become capitalistic. It became very important for me to recognize that and to understand that there was going to be no singular tradition that was going to provide you. And at a certain point, I recognized that what's the truth about spirituality is you have to do the work, you have to do the practice. And I was limiting myself in that. I was constantly going, well, what is the correct practice? And that's the wrong way to approach it. What you're supposed to do, I believe, is to just try. You try these things and you incorporate what works and you document it and you reflect upon it and you share with others. And then that practice grows and it becomes something more tangible and you will receive results. And you can find gurus or teachers everywhere, through friends, through communion, through books. The important thing is to try and incorporate those lessons and to create your own truth, your own spiritual practice, your own religious system that works for you. And this is very hard to do, but it is something that we're all capable of. And you don't have to begin that way. You can begin by following a system and by doing that until you retrieve results. But I think it's important at a certain point to recognize that there is no, truth that's held in exclusivity, right?
Right.
That the truths of one faith are the truths of all faiths. And it's important to recognize that we're all along similar journeys, if not the same, right? Like the purpose of life is for the many to know itself in its multiplicity, right? So we're naturally going to have an incredible multiplicity of views. Every individual has their own will, has their own truth, has their own path to take in their own reality. And we need to honor that, to see that in the other, and then incorporate it into our own.
Right. Yeah, like we are building in communion, and the work gets done much faster, right?
Exactly,
um
right?
like you and I originally started gravitating toward each other when it came to like tarot practice, and that was something that I was really comfortable sharing with my greater community, non spiritual, the secular community. I am comfortable sharing my tarot practice with them because it's sort of this more adopted, non-threatening type of spirituality that people, I think, are embracing in the zeitgeist due to how many people are identifying with Wicca and being witches and the popness of it. And you said there is something insidiously capitalistic about it, but there is a benefit from these practices because it does show kind of tangible, intuitive knowings in the external form of these cards, right? And then people can literally resonate with them externalized. And so, of course, I think it is a really interesting and obvious way to, in the material world, bring people into your spirituality through the connections in these tangible items like these cards, right? I think
Yeah,
that's why
for
so
sure.
many people do get into it, like for to starter pack of spirituality is.
Oh yeah, I definitely see that so often with people, and in my own self, what drew me and has always drawn me about tarot is that it is something that has always, since its very inception, existed in multiplicity. Like from the earliest versions of the tarot, the idea was to create your own decks, to have your own inspiration. There's this shared pool of symbology, which is ancient. And we can trace these symbols largely all the way back to ancient Sumeria and to Egypt. And there are these deep connections, but then they're constantly revived. There's this creative play that happens where people are encouraged to create and to design and to work with these symbols and to elevate them and to reimagine them in their current practice. And there's something that's so powerful about that. And also, what's so interesting to me about tarot is that it's not bound by any singular tradition, it's not owned by any singular culture. It's this wide practice that it may have its roots in, medieval Europe, but it has greatly expanded from there, and has never shied away from incorporating and being remixed. And I think it's important that we take these spiritual ideas and don't allow them to become rooted so deeply in tradition. Like, I'm not saying that I'm anti-traditional. It's important that we connect ourselves to the past, but I think it's also equally important that we are recreating in the now to be able
Mhm.
to imagine us evolving into the future. And something like tarot to me is truly representative of that aspect of spirituality.
Yes. And it's so funny because there was a couple of other things that since we have, come together in spiritual practice, we've definitely worked on expanding with each other, which is now we both are involved with like doing a yoga practice. And that I think ties right into what you're saying is like, of course, you respect that there's a tradition and that there's a structure and a hierarchy of yogic practice that goes very, very deep historically, and that there is, room in the expansion of it so that it benefits us, even if we're not doing it in that traditional sense, that it is something, there's something to it, right? So it's important to at least try it and see if it works for you. And fortunately it does work for us, like there's something, if I could recommend to people that are really reflective in their spiritual work, and if they do have anxiety, if they are living a lot in their mind space, that they do this body practice, right? The only body spiritual practice that I know of is yoga. I mean, like obviously people can do exercise in a meditative way, but the approach of doing yoga is the only one I know physically that people really do recommend to expand yourself spiritually.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that when you study these things anthropologically and historically, you recognize just how truly ancient they are, and how that there's always been a great variety of these ideas, and they've continued to evolve over time. And that's an important thing to recognize. Like, the yoga we have today is not the yoga that was practiced in the ancient Indus Valley by the Harappan people, even though that has its roots. And we can also see similar yogic practices that are done across the globe, such as Tai Chi or the Haskema of Russian Orthodoxy and various Greek Orthodoxy. And they're all these different but similar practices. And the ideas are always the same. Like yoga is about embodying spirituality. It's about controlling the breath,
Mhm.
using the reverberation of words to intone a love of spirit, a love of self, and to balance oneself with these energies in the now. And for me, for a long time, I was like, well, 90% of yoga in the West, well, it's fake. It's about exercise. It's about something other than spiritual practice. And that's not really true. At a certain point, you have to check your ego and just do the practice. And it's what you bring to the table that will make it an exercise or spiritual. If you're looking to
Yes.
find God and you focus on the breath and you focus on these movements, you will, in essence. You know, it's so important for people to understand, myself included, that we create with the mind, right? Constantly. And if you want something, especially a spiritual desire, that will be reflected. And if you want something else, then that will be reflected. So if you can focus the mind, which yoga and meditation help you do, this will all lead you down these paths. And as you do these work, people will come into your life. Like, I think it's so important to recognize that, like, you came to me at a time when I was ready and finally looking to branch out, and I had the confidence of self to talk about these things, because for so long I was unwilling to share, or I was afraid to share because
Mhm.
I had so much backlash and there was so much confusion. And just again, like growing up in an atheist household, it's seen as something that's questionable, something that's in a sense detrimental to others and hurtful to others. And
Yes.
I now see that's not true. And it's important for us to share our experience so that other people can learn. And they may not agree and they may not experience it the same, but if they're truly open, they will get something from it, you know.
Absolutely.
And this is
Yeah,
how
like
they, like, go ahead, sorry.
no, like for me with the same is like coming from a background where people in my family, largely a matriarchal line. And so like I said, I grew up pretty radical in my politics. And I really heavily identify with feminism. And so of course, I unchecked in my ego just rejected most conformed religions because I just recognized them right off the bat as harmful to women, exploitative towards women, or erasive to women's experiences, especially when it comes to spirituality. And it wasn't until I, started communicating with you and I identify you and your politics as definitely radical in feminism as well. And then I started to open up to, the lotus unfolds. I started to expand myself and think, okay, well, if Darren is somebody that I can identify holds very liberal, leftist feminist politics, and also can identify with some of these practices like Hinduism, then there's got to be something to it that I need to release my ego of what I assume is like an order that is harmful to women and really take what resonates and leave what doesn't. It wasn't until I met you that I would be able to identify with any type of traditional religious practices.
For sure. And it took me a really long time to reconcile that as well. You know, I had this desire for truth. And the thing with religion is it tries to always funnel you. It tries to tell you, well, if you want, it becomes circular reasoning. And philosophy helped me understand this, where so much of religious tradition is if you do X, you will have Y, and then it all comes back. You know, you want to know God, well, you believe in God, and then God will reveal itself. And that's a trapping. You know,
Mhm.
it's not 100% true. And I started to just recognize intuitively and through communion with other people how many of these spirits, many of these traditional ideas are cross-cultural. They're, you know, you see something like the Mercurian energy, and that's there's so many spirits that are associated with that idea cross-culturally, whether like we were talking about India with Ganesh, or Greece with Hermes, or even into, you know, African traditions with Papa Legba and Afro-Caribbean traditions with these kind of spirits as well. And it, if here's the thing that I had to recognize: if there's truth to this, if these spirits are real, they will reveal themselves to people. And it's people who create the trappings. We create these images. And so much of it is recognizing that the symbolic aspect of ourselves is limited. We understand things to a point, and we have to create these symbols in the real world. So we use our cultural backgrounds to connect to these spirits. And there's a truth there, like there's powerful things there. And it's important for us to recognize the reflection of the other in ourselves and the same kind of patterns. Like they're not the same, but they're not different, you know? And it's important for us to realize that these spirits are, and these energies are communal. They are everywhere. They are open. They are accepting. And you will find an expression. And oftentimes it begins with exploring your own tradition. And then through your own tradition, you're able to see the reflection in the other. But if you don't have a tradition, like I grew up with, no tradition. So it was very hard for me to connect to those roots. And for so much of people of European descent, that tradition has been destroyed. It has been lost to us. And it has been corrupted by a hierarchical, authoritarian version of Christianity, you know? And it took me a long time to come to terms with Christianity and to see the truth in it, that outside of these hierarchical, oppressive things of power, like Christ is about compassion, and that compassion energy is ever unfolding, you know, and it continues to manifest in the world outside of Christianity as well, right? We see the same kind of ideas, not exactly the same, but in my intuitive mind, I feel that they're so interconnected, like Krishna, you know, or Apollo, or many different ways that this light compassion is manifesting, you know. And this is true of all spirits, of all traditions, I think. And this is why I'm so enamored with that idea of philosophia perennis, that there's this perennial philosophy. It's ever unfolding. It's never, it evolves with us as we evolve along the path as human, as of humanity, until our eventual spiritual awakening and you reuniting with the one.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think that's really deep. I don't know if a lot of people are really focused on that with their spiritual practice quite the same way, but I do know that there's a thread underneath it, that current runs deep within everything, and that is kind of what people do get swept up on. That's where it starts, right? Like a lot of times when we are getting introduced to this stuff, like without a background, without a tradition, without anybody to, like, not a guru, but like somebody intergenerationally to show us the way, right? We fall into all these mini trappings of the ego and of the matrix and of, the patriarchy and all these other things, and many trappings along the way. But underneath it all, that current of unification, Christ consciousness, it is the thread that I think eventually does tie everything in. And eventually people do find their way untangled out of those mini trappings of ego and shadow and dark nights of the soul. And I think it's really, like you were saying, like everybody's journey is their own. Some people will stay trapped in some of those systems and never make it back to unification in this lifetime, and that's just their role to play. We all have to like as a pyramid, we all are the building blocks, right? And it's only together do we create the form. So I
Yeah, like,
think it's well, I was going to say, I think that is why people like you and I are drawn together, to reflect each other, these teachings absorb from one another and expand our block and make it a bigger and bigger structure. So thank you for joining me and helping expand this building block of the channel that I'm working on currently. And I'm sure I will have you on again and we'll focus on specific topics. But I just wanted to kind of like introduce people that are involved in my spiritual expansion and helping me, and people that I am in return providing and offering to as well. So thank you for being part of it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to, share my story with others. And I just hope that people take from it the central idea is one of compassion of the self and acceptance of multiplicity. And that when we
Mm.
approach these things with compassion and with trust, that it will reveal itself. And that's the central focus of my spiritual practice today.
Awesome. Glad I'm here for it. All right, Darren, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.